decentering like the Western narrative, because we're really familiar with Monet, Van Gogh, but there's so many incredible artists like the Szechuan Potters or even Margoum weavers. I really center it on each place that I go. I try to pull from that place and always be tapped into contemporary artists as well, because art is a living, breathing subject. So
right. So it keeps really changing and of course evolving. With the different civilizations, different generations as well. With young people, the perception is different from the older ones.
Yeah, it is very different. Yeah.
So art is really can have so many different interpretations and forms and right. So as an art teacher, is art required, in fact, as a subject to be taught?
It's a fundamental part of the curriculum. Like it's a requirement up through year 9, and then the students start to choose their exam groups. So after year 9 in secondary, up through year 13, it's not required, but it is an option. It's an IGCSE and then an A-levels.
They can take it as an option in A-levels.
Yep, so I have taught all the way through A-levels.
So it's a subject, it's a compulsory subject, I mean, from primary to secondary, and then it can be a choice with A-levels.
Yeah, IGC is where it starts to become a choice, and A-levels after if they choose.
All right.
And I have had both, and I do currently have IGSE, and then
Okay, so your goal as an art teacher, what is it exactly? What do you try to do?
I think my goal is, I know that certainly students are looking to, even at young ages, understand financial security and want to think about things like this. So a lot of students are hesitant, certainly in older ages, to go into art. But mine is really to help them understand that art is so many things. It's about understanding culture, it's about problem solving. So if I can help them figure out how to be creative, how to think outside the box, how to engage with, even just engage with their hands, I think that's something so important, especially even from when I started teaching 10 years ago in the classroom, but even before that as a sort of art assistant. The way technology, it's of course has many benefits, but the developmental skills and the hand-eye coordination and just the sitting with ourselves and being peaceful is really a challenge. Is that we have to actively develop those skills, because we're all, adults and students alike, are used to instant gratification and constantly fidgeting. So my focus has really shifted to getting students to ask questions, trust their own creative intuition, sit with things, work on things, engage with their senses, and certainly that's my goal when they're younger, to sort of understand how to be in community with each other, make things, be curious. That's probably some of my biggest goals, a holistic approach. And then as they're older, of course, to be successful in their exams, but really to understand how to engage and ask themselves questions and kind of take that long road of really discovering things.
Give us an idea of some kind of projects that you work on with the early stages, for instance, to familiarize them with the notion of art in general.
Yeah, something that we've done recently that I think year 2 and 3 we're doing is we were looking at Panamanian molas, which are basically traditionally worn as shirts, but they're layered textile applique. So we printed these beautiful, colorful images, so they're getting exposed to art in other cultures. And then we talk about textile. What is the textiles in our culture? And they got to build them with paper. We didn't quite get the sewing skills yet in year 2, but sort of the idea of layering, coming back to a project. Also, we looked at the animals that were in the images and the pieces. And so what I like to do is connect it to where they are. So we talked about what are animals here, what might go in your mola. It's like, we're not in Panama. Panamanian molas have fish and turtles and things. Tunisian molas might have something else. So sort of not keeping art as, especially when you're doing international art, I think it's important to always keeping it as a living, breathing thing. So not just to paint a Monet bridge per se, but we talk about why was Monet painting that bridge? What was he doing? He was learning to paint outside. He was looking at the light. So we might actually go and, for example, in primary we have an animal garden, so we try to go outside and we looked at the bridge and we painted the bridge. So it's not just about copying, but about putting yourself in the shoes of the artist. How were they thinking? What were they doing? So they're really understanding the ideas behind it, and not just, you can teach anyone to copy something, but it's really to understand, to stand in the the place of the greats and understand why they were working the way they did.
And to do it their own way, to come up with something that really looks like them, that really something that
gives them ownership to adapt to the culture they're in, the place they're in, the family they have. So I think if you don't do that, art can feel really stagnant. I taught art in inner city Milwaukee for 6 years, and if I wasn't adapting the Renaissance painters to help them understand why, or teaching them about contemporary artists that studied them and look like them and have lived their lives similar to them, it won't, it has to respond, it has to be resonant with the kids, or it won't.
And you feel that, for example, the students are more into something that is like classical, more into the classical rather than into the modern, or vice versa?
I just think it's a really big mix. I think they tend to see things on social media that because there's a lot of like craft and projects, so they'll want to kind of see, there's a lot of art that's sort of wow art, like kind of, someone splashes a painting and it looks like a portrait of someone, or they sort of want to know how to do that, but they also are really interested in when they see old things, or they're curious about modern art because oftentimes the price doesn't match. When we're looking at it, it's hard for us to understand, the famous banana that was taped to the wall, or even someone like Mark Rothko that just does pure fields of color, who's a personal favorite of mine. But if you're trying to explain to 10-year-olds why this red square costs $40 million, it's hard for them to.
It's hard to figure out.
So they're really curious about modern art, but they're typically said, I can do that. Does this mean I can be in a museum? And I said, maybe. Maybe there's. And I told them there's a lot of bad art in museums, and then there's a lot of great art that's not in museums. So we have to be looking everywhere and always be discerning. Just because it's in one place doesn't give it value. So in both ways, you can find really important, thoughtful, engaging pieces or that speak about culture in somewhere, on the road to Szechuan or in Szechuan, and you can also find things. So it's I try to teach them to look for. They seem to really be interested in all the things. I think it depends on how you explain it and tell them the story.
How you approach it.
Yeah.
How you tell them the story. Right. When you design the curriculum about art in general, how do you ensure that each student is given the opportunity to improve their skills?
Well, I like to, when we design the curriculum, it's based on, certainly in secondary, it's based on Cambridge standards and schemes of work. But, for example, I learned a lot in my school. I had my master's in art education, and so we really studied thinking about backwards planning, which is sort of thinking about the goal and then developing the skills, or planning backwards, so you're not just only having one final copy in mind or one final endpoint, but you're allowing room for the process. So I think when you do that, you naturally adapt to the students in your room because everyone has their own process. So if you're putting the emphasis, I tend to be really a process-based teacher. So when you go to our art shows, they won't all look the same. There's not one red cardinal all across the board. It sort of defeats the purpose for me. Of course, sometimes you want them to learn how to draw a bird or learn how to do a specific thing, but I find that if you kind of share the idea or the goal and what you want to explore and then help them to develop the skills, it makes room. So in IGCs, we're working on structure right now, and one of their examples to explore structure to build up their final outcome was to take a walk around. Like I took a walk from La Marsa to Sidi Boussaid. I took photos. I shared with them my photos when we analyzed them, and then I gave them the same assignment. So they all had very different photos, but the common theme was structure. And then they could look at each other's. We did a gallery walk with Inglass. So I think if you kind of leave room for the process, but then you're always giving students the benefit of, we have nice small class sizes, so I really get to each student, check in, they'll write me a note, I'll leave one on their painting. Year 9 are painting landscape paintings right now, and they each got to choose their own length. They had to do a little research before. So some chose ones that they felt like maybe were more at their skill level, but then I said, if you choose a really simple one, I'm going to really make sure that we are looking at, the different elements of art, and each piece actually has its own, they might look simple, but don't choose something that's simple, choose interesting to you.
Right.
And so they really stayed with their paintings, and they chose the whole range of things, Georgia O'Keeffe's to 18th century Hokusai Japanese prints. So it's been really neat to see And each child, we have a wide range in that class, and they've each sort of found I try to adapt my instructions I give them to, if I know they have more skills, I push them, but also kind of giving them that range. So
right. Did you have any outstanding works, of art, from your students?
Yeah, I couldn't name them, but I will say
your time at BIST. Yeah, let's say the British International.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I've had one A-level student so far, and she's had really some outstanding work. My IGSC girls are producing beautiful
form
work.
Of art?
Typically painting, although we took a trip to Nabil last year,
right?
And that was with my now year 9s and the year 8s, and it was really, you never really know if kids have worked with clay that much. They came up with some really incredible pieces, and they got to spend the whole day, and a woman named Noor who has a mark called Balloon, so they got to go through the whole process. Honestly, some of my favorites, I know it's going to sound, some of my favorites are really, truly the youngest kids.
Really?
Sorry to my older students, but I do believe that I fundamentally believe that we're all born artists. Of course, there's a range of skills, but the way EYFS and first and second graders tend to put their lines in the color without questioning themselves. And then we get to about year 5 and they start to sort of see their friends, compare, we kind of, you see them shut down. They can't produce with but those younger years really, I find myself wanting to hang them on my wall often. I mean, I love the older kids too, and of course it's a different type of skill.
So you think that's really the right age to encourage creativity and motivate them, in producing, these forms of art.
Yeah, I think having it that age, early learning I think it's as essential as literacy and math, because it really is about expressing yourself.
Right.
And I find kids that maybe are struggling with their speech or things love art and excel because they can express themselves in a different way. But I also think when they're older, when they start to shut down, if you ask most adults, I'm not saying my personal colleagues, but in general, colleagues I've had since I'm the art teacher, they'll say, oh, I can't, or, I have really creative colleagues too, but many adults will say, I can't do art, I'm not good. And I always tell the students, if you can write, you can draw. It's just about, it's practicing, right. It's just making marks, putting shapes together. So I think at any age it's important. I do think it's important when we're older to keep encouraging them too.
Right, that's wonderful. I can imagine it's really a very challenging, a job. I mean, to keep them, to keep that art, what do we call it? Inspiration, going on with the students or with the kids, because this is, as you said, at an early age, this is where you really build up with all the other skills. So it's really very important to give it that importance. How do you get students to get more invested in art in general?
I think the best way to do that is make sure you're teaching a broad range of types of art. I mean, I know I mentioned painting, but we certainly look at the biennales, we look at ancient art. I like to juxtapose things together so that they're seeing that, the Impressionists were inspired by Japanese painters. Current people were, we look up who they were inspired by so they can see that chain of art movements. But also teaching painting next to sculpture or giving choice. Sometimes kids can do their project in a different way, or some days we just have days where we explore mediums. So it's sort of like what we call like a low stakes day, where you're just using the materials and letting them just play, because that is where creativity comes from. Sometimes you have to teach kind of the hard skills like perspective and things like this, but nothing's more exciting than seeing high schoolers still get excited by making a new color or letting them truly just engage in the materials. So I think finding interesting materials, listening to them. I ask them at the beginning of the year, the midterm, and at the end, what are you interested in? What have we not covered? Because we do have an international school, so some kids I've had for years, they've been at this for years. Some kids are coming we are always getting new students coming in, so they're bringing different experience. Maybe they were in South Africa, or maybe they were in the American system, so asking students generally what they're interested in and not assuming. I've learned a lot from that, especially in my earlier years, because sometimes they are interested in things you'd never imagine. So letting them lead, and then also telling them they don't have to love art, they don't even have to be good at art, but just that the goal is to be curious, to keep trying, and that they will be better by the end of the year. It's just about improvement and really improving with yourself. It's not a competition. Right. I really don't like to place emphasis. I like to ask them what they like. They'll ask me sort of, do you like it? Is it good? And I'll say, do you like it? Or if that's too big of a question, I'll say, what's your favorite part? If they hate their painting or they're stuck on their drawing, I'll say, well, pick out a part that you're really excited about. And then they usually will say, even if they're like, want to tear it up, I say or if they don't like it, I'll say, keep it for later. We're not going to rule anything out today, and we can do something with it later. But keep it in your sketchbooks. It should be full of mistakes. Mm-hmm. So just sort of taking that emphasis off perfection.
So how do you assess students' work of art in this case? How do you assess them?
How do I assess? I guess it really depends. If, for example, with the younger years, you're making sure that they understand mixing colors. So you're really slowing down into kind of going back and forth, like between letting them just explore and then actually teaching. Like for the younger kids, sometimes I'll only give them the primary colors. Mm-hmm. So it really forces them to just find green, find orange. We'll incorporate songs so they kind of already will have body movements, things like that, so they remember sort of playing and mixing purple.
Right.
So I think it's important to let students find things on their own. They really want you to give them the answers. They really are used to sort of that, and I think that's true for students always, but even more so now with sort of being able to Google something quickly, or they want the problem solved. So I do like to let them, I don't want to say struggle, but I like to give them resources and then encourage them to sort
freedom.
of...
The freedom really to find things by themselves and to do things by themselves.
To engage with the materials, to find... I try to give them multimodal supports for different learners. Right. So we always have a visual, we have a kind of a goal for that day, but then I'll give them printed resources that they have in front of them. Sometimes we use devices, sometimes we don't. Sometimes I really like to say, I didn't go to school with device. There were no computer, engage within your mind, or like we have books in the classroom. I have my gooms up on the wall. If they feel stuck, I said, okay, next time I'll bring some printed images in. But I really try to keep them, trusting their own creativity, asking them questions about what did they see this weekend, or so sometimes it's direct, specific instruction, and in that case we'll try to do it together on the board. Especially in the younger years, they get really excited, like let's draw a polar bear together. So what do we have to put next? What are we missing? What does this fur look like? How do we make lines that look like that? Breaking it down into that. And then with the older kids, I do try to give them, I try to learn the way I learn, which I really liked, which is some instruction and some bits, and then sort of stand back and let them sort it out.
They can come up with.
But I do ask them, I'll always ask them to sort of like, we'll do a paper at the end, like leave me what you're having a question with, and I'll read it after class, and I'll come up and make sure those students, make sure I get to the ones that seem like they're struggling or.
How much theory and how much practice, hands-on job in your teaching?
I guess.
Is it different from the younger ones to the older ones?
Yeah, I mean the younger ones, we want to get them working right away. Sometimes I try to. I had a teacher that, I guess a colleague told me that said, we want them to be living in the land of doing. I think it was something to this effect. And it really stays with me, especially younger kids.
Right.
Sometimes I get them engaged right away, and then we can kind of pause and talk about what happened, why didn't the material work, or I'll ask what are we having issues with, and if they're all saying the same thing, we kind of solve the problem together. So I like to mix theory with practice because they have to be engaged and curious, or the theory sort of, it doesn't stick. So it's sort of like back and forth. But definitely we want to be always making things, engaging things.
And you try to implement that by having them do a project work.
Yeah, project work, hands-on, studio work. Yeah.
So the purpose of the project work?
Yeah, really to be exploring, fundamentally developing their skills. Sometimes, like, we just started a clay, and kids always they just want to touch the clay right away. But in this case, I did choose a few videos, or the older kids, I'll put them on Google Classroom and ask them to watch them at home, and we'll talk about them just so they sort of come to class ready, sort of with like a garden, like you're ready to plant the seeds. They've already got questions. Or Google Arts and Culture, for example, has really interesting things. So maybe there'll be a game or something, and then they'll go into, you can kind of squeeze the theory in that way. Or we'll choose like a very short 4-minute video from the Metropolitan Museum, or we just watched one on the Sejnan women, and it was silent. Like I try to gauge if they're, rustling and seem like you're getting ready. Sometimes I'll just let them try it, and then when they have questions and feel like they have hit a place, then I'll bring them a little bit more theory. So it sort of depends on the material.
Right.
Yeah.
When you mentioned Sajnen, you talk about art and craftsmanship. So how can you make the difference between the two? Can you explain the difference?
Yeah, I don't. Well, that's like one of the hugest questions. So I think it's important that they understand that that people are asking that question. I don't think I have the answer. I certainly love craft. I consider, I'm wearing Tunisian jewelry. I consider it. I think one way that it can be explained is sort of a lot of times craft or traditional crafts have a function. Mm-hmm. So like ceramic bowls or woven things, textiles are getting more popular now in terms of fine art, but hadn't always been considered sort of a high art form. So you mean
they have a function because they are needed in our daily life?
In our daily life, so they tend to not be valued in the same way.
Right.
But so I like to challenge that idea of like, why do we value? Say we were just looking at the story of Grecian urns and how artisans, and there is an actual story, like before the Renaissance, creativity wasn't really valued. It was producing workshops, ateliers, apprenticeships. People made things, and there was a few wealthy patrons. And then during the Renaissance, with Michelangelo, these great painters, the idea of the artist rock star sort of took off. And so it sort of started to separate creativity, individualism. So I think both are really important. We looked at a video that explored Grecian urns next to ancient pottery, and then we watched a video that interviewed the women of Sajnen. And so we talked about now their values changed quite a bit because they changed what they made. They were making bowls and pots, and they started shifting to making dolls and different things that weren't necessarily functional, but now they're UNESCO certified. So I kind of give my students like these stories, and I think it's about like our margooms, traditional Tunisian carpets, are something that they're all familiar with. They've all seen, many of them have in their homes, and to really break down the process so they understand how those are made, they start to understand the value of, because if you walk on something every day or you just see it, if you don't know what goes into something, it's really hard to value it.
And you make them choose whether they would like, to go into the direction of making an art piece or a craftsmanship piece.
Yeah, I guess I actually don't necessarily distinguish, because some of my favorite art, and you do find like folk art in the Louvre, so it's really more about, to me it's more, when I think of craftsmanship, or I like to say craftspersonship, so non-gender it, but I like to think more about, did that artist engage, did they pay attention, did they do this to the best of their artistic ability? Mm-hmm. So I think of getting them to look at, could they have taken more time in this, or did someone do this thoughtfully, and then can they apply that to their own work?
Right.
But it's an age-old question, and it's important that we value both, I think, because both have a place.
Yeah, that's right.
They can work together. I think that's the best way that they can work together.
That's right. I mean, the as we say, the pleasure of looking at the piece is really the law.
Mm-hmm.
That can really rule in the world of art. In general, whether it is art or crafts or whatever. I mean, as long as you enjoy looking at something, as long as you see beauty in it, and you observe it, and you try to appreciate it, and you get inspired from it. I mean, that's really what it takes, to consider it an art form.
And I think also it's important that we don't place value only on like things that have financial value. So the women of Sajnen, they dig their clay, they make the dyes from natural roots. Right. Of course, financially, that doesn't cost as much. They're digging clay from the ground. But if you hear the way they talk about how they think about their art, the way they, meditate or clear their mind, that's passed down through generations. Yeah. That is something that has value. Whereas someone like Jeff Koons, his work sells for $80 million or whatever, and it's fiberglass that's made by assistants sometimes. So I tell the students it's important to challenge that idea of, technically Jeff Koons is internationally known and more financially successful, but where is the value? Like, where should we place value? So I think it's good to pose those questions.
Right. How do you stay up to date with trends and techniques in the art world today? I
personally have an art practice. I mostly do watercolor, but I like to, on my own keep taking new classes. I think it's important to take, like I like to take workshops or classes or attend things that challenge me so that I can feel like a student. When I'm taking a new weaving class and I actually am really struggling, I can remember what my students are feeling like when they're trying something new. So I think being an active artist is important. We had, there's a wonderful contemporary artist named Alcide, and he does amazing graffiti and Arabic calligraphy.
Like
and
Paris,
Yeah, all over the place. And he just did a new piece in the Marsa. And he is a friend of ours, and he'd invited our students to come, and some of them did. It was the second day of school, so it was hard to get them, but it sort of happened last minute. But so I shared with the students, like, this is based on really old traditions. He has a really beautiful story of how he comes to his work. But the students were invited and participated and helped in that. So that's something they can see contemporary art happening now. And then also making sure that they're visiting places like the Bardo, like Neba, where we see this old tradition, but also meeting people that are using those old traditions to have contemporary financial success. So I think exposing students to a lot of things and just continuing to go out, talk to students, ask them what they're interested in, and then I sort of bring up, artists or just ask them what they're curious about.
Now today with the infiltration of AI in all fields, how do you see the impact of AI in art in general?
Oh, I have so many personal thoughts about AI. So
it's more difficult than
I'm trying to answer it diplomatically. Yeah. This is a tricky question. I think AI. I think first of all, as educators, we should be open to something that it's not my personal. I tend to be very low tech, but at the same time, it exists in the world. It's not going anywhere, and the students are curious and interested. So I need to. That could be true of anything. That could be true of acrylic paint or certain ways of doing thing, or even anime. Sometimes kids are like, "Is anime art?" And if you shut down too many things as a teacher, not only do you stop learning, but your kids will stop asking you, engaging with you. So they're curious about AI. I think it's really important to not rule out, and if they ask, can we use this, or what if we just did this, and just to talk about, that's where I think the importance of process comes in, because the value of figuring things out, and that AI can be a useful tool, but it will never be the only tool. And how we feel when we make art, and why we want to stay curious, and I don't think anything can replace that human connection to engaging with materials. Of course, AI can make interesting things, and more are hard to decipher what is AI. And so I guess just teaching them to be discerning, use it in an ethical way, think about that it is actually AI is from many artists and other people putting in their images, so AI couldn't exist without artists first.
Right.
I guess just, it's something I'm still learning. We talk about in school all the time how to, you want to be on the cutting edge of something, and also make sure that you're teaching students how to use it as a tool and not as an end. And
are you not worried that it can kill imagination? It can kill creativity?
I think if we don't teach students to engage with it and be critical of it, like use critical thinking skills, which is just good teaching anywhere, then I think of course it could, just like anything. But I do think I ask students sometimes just to think about how you feel after you've done a painting, or when you really sat and focused, or when you've worked on a drawing and you sort of get to that point. It's, I guess, to check in about what their process is, because you can make cool stuff with AI, and then just sort of to ask them, what is the next step? What can we do with it now? Or I think of it as like a tool in art, not like an end result.
Right.
I certainly know people have made AI films and things like this, and so we say, there's a process, there's a reason we read books, and there's a reason if we start shortcutting everything, we sort of eliminate this creative thinking process where you learn things along the way. So that's kind of how I explain it to them, that you'll miss all the good stuff is when you're figuring things out, when you're struggling, when you're, exploring something, or when you're discovering something organically. And so I just try to caution them, but also ask them questions and be engaged and celebrate when they do make something interesting. I'm still figuring it out. It's not something that I personally love, but I haven't really had a lot of issues with it. They tend to, right now, what they seem to want to do is really challenge like see how I feel about it, or see how teachers feel. And so I think if you respond with curiosity and ask them to respond with curiosity, they tend to ask more questions and say, yeah, that's a great, you could use AI for this, or you could ask ChatGPT this, but it might not help you understand your personal connection. So going back to that personal connection in the process, really, they do seem to understand that, yeah, they like sitting and they feel good when they sit and work with clay, and nothing replaces that, the tactility of things.
Right.
So,
right. So maybe the last question for you, Kelley, if you could pass on any wisdom, about art in general to your students, what could it be?
I think the biggest thing...
Especially working in an international environment.
Yeah.
And you have done that, previously as well with your, career, teaching in different countries.
Yeah, I've lived in France and Guatemala, taught in a couple places, so...
Right.
I think really just to stay curious and open to different types of art, different types of people.
Open.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing.
Tolerance and openness.
Yeah, that's the sort of closing ourselves off is sort of the death of creativity, and also empathy, and we owe that to each other now more than ever, and especially in international communities, to stay engaged, stay curious, ask each other about each other's cultures, be open-minded to things you see, different ways of, you can kind of liken it to language. We have many languages. English is our language in school, but the students come with many different home languages, so there's as many ways to draw something as there is to say something and express. So I would just say to stay curious, and also when kids are really into something, even if they think it's not cool or kind of like a quirky interest, I really push them, especially as they get older, to stay engaged with that, because when you're older, that is the thing that will kind of, you'll probably find success in, or at least joy in doing, whether it's anime or drawing horses. I don't know. Kids are into all different. I said, don't lose that. Whatever your quirky interests are, just try and stay engaged in that, because that's really what will,
what will prevail.
Yeah, what will keep you, especially as we get older, we need that. We need to, and most adults, if they get the chance to be creative, my coworkers and my friends ask me, can you take me out on a painting day? Can you, I think most artists, or most adults, want to be creative and think they can't anymore. So just to encourage each other and stay open to things, and not be afraid to express yourself, not be tied to the outcome as much.
Right. Maybe one thing that I've forgotten to ask about, how much time is allocated to teaching art, at the early stages and at secondary school?
Yeah, the early, so I currently am at primary. They have 45 they have other STEAM and other things that they do aside from me as the art specialist, but in terms of just with me, 45 minutes, and then EYFS has longer. They have 2 sessions. Yeah. Right. And then the older kids, it sort of ramps up depending on their age, but right now they have 2 a week, and then once it's IGCSEs, it's 3 to 4, A-levels can be 5. It kind of depends on where they are in that part. But yeah, in 45 minute, we're at 55-minute sections. 55-minute sections.
55-minute section, okay.
It never feels like enough, but it's always,
Yeah, that's right, especially when you talk about art. Time is never enough.
Yeah.
Because time can change everything.
Yeah, my room is open and it's attached to the cafeteria, so I'm pretty flexible if they want to finish something, or that's why we have enrichments, and so kids get to come after school and do things too.
Right. Well, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Kelley.
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.